This is intake number 2, where we will be talking about the initial interview, relationship and rapport, and records. This is an interesting topic because the initial interview acts both as a way to gather information and as a way to develop the initial relationship. You have to do two things at once, and you have to be very careful not to accidentally do one thing wrong in favor of the other. You do need to build a relationship, and you do need to get information, and we'll talk a little bit about the ways that you can focus too much on either. It is a balancing act, and it takes some time to get used to, and you don't always nail it, but we're going to talk about the process to doing it. So when we talk about the assessment or the intake session, we're really talking about the same thing in most contexts. The assessment is really a clinical judgment of what's going on based on the information that's given. So it's kind of like an action that you do as a skilled professional. The intake session can sometimes just be gathering information with no assessment. Sometimes if you have an intake session, it'll be distinct from the assessment in that somebody will do it who has kind of an entry-level degree, like maybe a bachelor's degree, who will be sitting or talking with somebody, or sitting and talking with somebody, or maybe doing it over the phone or something, to where they're just getting the bare minimum information. They may be focusing on just getting insurance information. They may be focusing on getting some basic medical information or something like that, without delving into the mental issues too much. But for the purposes of this class and this assignment, we're going to be talking about assessment and the intake session at the same time, as if it's the same process. So the idea of the assessment or the intake session is to gather as much information as possible. We have to balance a questionnaire-style interview with a regular discussion. There are certain things that we have to get from the individual in terms of information. We need to know about traumatic experiences, family dynamics. We'd like to know if they have some kind of substance abuse history, if there's a medical history that's important to them in terms of the family, like maybe there's cancer that runs in the family or something like that. Those are important things to know. We also will talk a little bit during the first session in terms of what they can do on a daily basis, called the activities of daily living. And we'll also talk about some of the struggles that they have emotionally with relationships. So there's a lot of information that goes on there. We have to get the information, but we can't just do it in terms of asking questions. It's not supposed to be an interrogation. It's supposed to be a questionnaire. So we'd want to have a discussion that asks the questions. When we talk about interviewing in terms of the intake session, we can have as many forms as there are practices, meaning that you might have one practice or one organization that asks some questions differently than others. Some focus on different aspects differently than others, and it really just depends on a couple of things. One is the practice itself, and the other is what is the governing body of that practice. So here in Michigan, we have a set of standards that are set forth, especially in Southwest Michigan, by an organization called Southwest Michigan Behavioral Health. It's abbreviated SWMBA. And that organization is responsible for making sure that all the information that's appropriate for Medicaid reimbursement is gotten. So it's really based on Medicaid, which is kind of this lowest standard that you have to meet in order to get information, and it requires a lot of different things. We're not going to get into the nuts and bolts of that. That's more for a clinical or practitioner class, usually reserved for things like master's level practitioners. We're going to cover some of the broad topics that go into there, but not kind of the not any of the legal aspects that go into developing those processes. The good news is that if you're good at a basic format, you're going to be good at most of the other ones too. So if you do an intake assessment and do a good job for the purposes of this class, you'll be able to do the same task in many different practices without hardly any problems. I've spoken with several graduates who have done this kind of work after Olivet, and they say that they've had no problem transitioning from the information you're learning in this class to actual practice. And that is how it should be, because I modeled these things after current methods of gathering information based on current procedures. As a practitioner myself, I have to do these, so I'm passing this information on to you. So here's the information that we have to include in an intake or an assessment. We need to have the client information and demographics. We need to know things like race, ethnicity, biological sex. We need to know things about gender. We need to know where they live, how much money they make. Those are important parts of an overall assessment because we know that there are certain aspects that can combine to create an overall narrative of the problems that somebody might be experiencing between their ears. Think if somebody has low socioeconomic status and who is a member of the LGBTQ community. That person can have low ability to find resources or to gather resources for many different reasons, especially if it has to do with monetary resources. So if somebody's having a struggle with some kind of sexual identity or gender identity issue, then they can find that it's difficult to find services because they don't have money to seek them out, to join groups or to pay for good therapy or whatever. So we can recognize that somebody might struggle financially, and that could be a barrier to having other issues resolved that they're having problems with. We include the presenting problem or problems. It can be plural or singular. The presenting problem is something that we have from the client's perspective. The presenting problem is what is going on from the perspective of the individual in their own words. We'll talk about activities of daily living in the assessment. There are many different aspects of activities of daily living that we're going to take a look at, but it is your responsibility to make an assessment of how well somebody is attaining these activities. So one of the activities of daily living is hygiene. Is somebody able to have clean clothes? Are they able to wash themselves? Are they able to get out of bed to brush their teeth and things like that? And we have to rate that somehow. Generally, we have like a scale of 1 to 7, where 7 is no problem at all and 1 is complete deficits in an activity of daily living. But it depends on where you go. Ideally, you would have some kind of structured scale that you can use to track progress. So normally we assign numbers to it. So on a scale of 1 to 7, somebody came in with a hygiene score of 3, and one of the goals was to increase their hygiene from a 3 to a 5 in 3 months or something like that. That way you can measure something. When we talk about goals and objectives, we'll talk about SMART goals and how we make things specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. We're going to talk about the history of the problem. So if they say something's a problem in the presenting problem, we're going to say, okay, how long has this been going on? What kind of things have this affected? We'll look at the history of the problem. We're also going to look at the family background. And if you've taken family dynamics, it's reasonable to do a short genogram on the individual. Now, for the purposes of the assignment that's attached to this, I will be assigning you a partner to do that with. And we're going to talk about the boundaries that we're going to have as a partner to determine how much detail we go into and the kind of things that you talk about. Remember, we're not talking about actual problems, okay? We're talking about these problems that are set up in role play situations, so we're not getting into too much trouble bordering on this quasi-therapeutic boundary, because we are not going to therapize each other. We'll also talk about personal history. So aside from the history of the problem, we'll talk about personal history. You know, where did you grow up? How was the family life when you were growing up? Did you meet developmental milestones? How was it like being in your friend groups? Things like that. We'll talk about any previous counseling. One of the things that's important to know is if somebody has had previous experience with some kind of counseling or therapeutic setting, because we can ask them, what has worked for you? What hasn't worked for you? We can talk about some of the things that they imagine would be better this time around. And what's also nice is that they have a perspective on the process to know some of the ways that they feel like they might be able to be helped better than what they had in the past. Or they might have had a completely successful counseling episode in the past, but they can't see that person for whatever reason. Maybe the patient, maybe the client or the counselor moved away or something like that. So we'll talk about the previous counseling experiment. We'll also talk about risk assessment. Is somebody likely to harm themselves or others? We'll talk a little bit about suicide risk. We'll talk about self-harm behaviors. We'll also talk about some of the things that will protect individuals from harming themselves, and also things that might contribute to them harming to themselves. When we get into an assessment an assessment lecture in Module 2, then we'll talk more about that. My computer whacked out. We're back. I didn't move the mouse more frequently enough. Okay. So the risk assessment will be in module 2, or excuse me, unit 2, because it has a place with assessment, what I'm trying to say, assessment instruments. We'll also include a diagnostic statement, which is very dangerously termed. We're not going to be diagnosing anybody, but what we are going to be doing is talking about kind of a narrative, so a clinical summary that summarizes these previous points and says, based on what we're seeing here, it's likely that this person is feeling anxiety, or this person is feeling depressed, or this person has a somatoform disorder, or whatever it is. So for the purposes of teaching you this, you will include a diagnostic statement as a practitioner. As a student, we're not going to be doing a diagnostic statement. We're going to be doing a clinical summary, which is kind of just a story about what's going on that is not diagnostic. And then last are some treatment goals. That's the thing you'll usually end with in an assessment, because that's how you get paid. When an insurance company is going to pay for a service, they want to know that you are doing something to achieve a goal, and you as a clinician are going to be doing something actively to achieve that goal, called an intervention. So we'll include goals. We're going to separate the goals from the intake assessment, because we're going to look at goals. Well, I shouldn't say that. We are going to separate goals into a different lecture, because we want to take a look at that distinct from the intake assessment or the initial interview, because it requires a little bit more to do than to just include it in a lecture, almost as if it's kind of blending into everything else. It really is because it needs its own lecture. It's that important. So let's talk about activities of daily living. Activities of daily living is a general way for us to assess how people are functioning in the real world. So there are lots of categories of where people can be having deficits in daily life, and we'll start with housing. So are people able to feel satisfied with the housing that they have? Are they safe in their house? Can they afford their house within reason? And do the people that they live with contribute to a positive environment in the house? And there are lots of varying answers to that, because obviously somebody could be satisfied with the housing that they have but not with their roommates, or it could be affordable but not safe. So there are lots of different ways that people could answer the questions about housing. So if I were going to be doing an intake assessment, I would say something like, hey, tell me about where you live. Is it safe? Can you afford it? Are the people you live with nice to you? And they would kind of answer those questions more or less in a story, and I would paraphrase their words into kind of this bullet point or maybe short list of information. We'd also talk about managing money. Is the person able to effectively budget even if the money is scarce? Now, when we talk about managing money, we're not talking about necessarily how much or how little they have, but can they make do with what they have? And if they cannot make do with what they have, then we might have a money management issue. It's also possible that they just flat out don't make enough money to make ends meet. But that's still kind of a money managing domain, because it's financial, even though it's not necessarily their fault that they can't make do with the money that they have. Maybe they were living paycheck to paycheck and got fired. Maybe someplace got shut down. Maybe a global pandemic hit and they couldn't work anymore, and there was some kind of hiccup with them getting unemployment benefits. So the managing money part is the person able to budget effectively even there is no money? Okay. Next is problem solving. Can they figure out solutions to ordinary problems? Okay. Let's say that they can't get online to pay for their phone bill, so they don't pay their phone bill. Okay, there's a problem to be solved there. Can they not pay their phone bill? Can they not access the internet? What is it? And you can say that this person has a difficult time solving ordinary problems, because there are lots of different ways to pay your cell phone bill. Kind of like if you're a student, I've been a student, if you're a student and you are going to submit an assignment and something doesn't work and you just give up. Like, okay, that's not very good problem solving, because there are probably other ways for you to solve the problem. Maybe you could email a professor. Maybe you could try re-uploading an assignment in a different format, or whatever it is. So the ordinary problem solving is their ability to come across a problem, solve it using ordinary effort. Next is social network. Do people feel a part of a social group, or do they have adequate relationships? It's a very important one because people will oftentimes develop affiliations with individuals, but not really friendships. So even though you feel like you are a part of a group, it might not be a worthwhile endeavor to be a part of a group. If we kind of look at the scope of the college experience, sometimes you can feel like you're a part of a group. Maybe it's a sports team, a club organization, fraternity, sorority, or whatever it is. You can be a member or you can be affiliated with that group, but you may not feel like you're a part of it. So we want to check in to see if people feel a part of a group. Now, if people say something like, yeah, I have 5 really close friends, and I say, okay, what do you and your friends do? Tell me about that. I said, well, we play poker once a week. Okay, what else? Well, that's it. Okay, they're a part of a group, but it might not be a strong social network. So when you ask people what kind of group they're in, you have to consider the fact that they may be affiliated with the group, but not really a strong part, or that group might not be very supportive of their needs to be in a friend group. Next is productivity, and by the way, these are in no particular order, so you could ask about productivity in the same vein as managing money. So you could say, are you working and able to put or make ends meet? That's productivity. Are you working? Can you make ends meet? That's managing money. So you can ask those two questions together. So the person is employed or otherwise engaged in worthwhile endeavors. Sometimes people will be working and not making a lot of money because maybe they're working towards something. Right now, a lot of entrepreneurial positions are like that, like maybe photography or whatever. So maybe I'm a photographer, but the winter is really slow for me because I normally do weddings, or I'll do I will do graduation open houses or senior pictures or whatever. So in the wintertime, things are a little bit slow. So if I ask the person, hey, are you employed right now? And they said, well, no, not really. I don't have any jobs. I might just stop there. But if I think to myself, well, this is something where people work more during a certain period, then you could say, yes, they are still engaged in worthwhile endeavors because undoubtedly doing something related to their field. Kind of like teachers or college professors, to where we aren't necessarily teaching classes in the summer and over Christmas break, but we're doing a lot of other things that are related to that. Maybe doing something for preparing a boatload of online classes that takes your entire summer, for example. You're still doing something that's worthwhile, but the productivity might be a little bit lower because you aren't really doing anything to bring in money at that point. Now, we still get paid, but you're not, we get paid by students being in the seats, and we aren't necessarily having anybody in the seats. So productivity is kind of low because we're getting paid and not getting any income for it. Obviously we spread out our payments across the year, and we also budget for payroll and things like that over the entire year from student payments. But generally, if we aren't teaching people, then we are kind of considered, maybe by outsiders, to not be working, which couldn't be further from the truth. Just saying. Next is communication. Can people speak effectively and represent ideas effectively? If you ask somebody, hey, when you have something to say, do people listen to you? And if they kind of ramble on and say, yeah, well, they kind of listen to me, but, they give up on me because ... Usually what happens is that people will talk about a certain topic and not want to be heard. Maybe they don't convey their ideas effectively and it puts people off. Whatever it is, we need to address the idea of communicating effectively. Now, nutrition is a good one that we have to consider. So nutrition, you can also lump hygiene into that. Because it has to do with self-care. So nutrition is when people have adequate amounts of nutritious food. We have to be careful about the word nutritious because if somebody has food and is able to get full off of the food they have, they may construe that as being healthy. The reality is that we can eat a tremendous amount of junk food, right? I know that. And when we have a lot of junk food, we might feel full, but it's not nutritious. So we have to talk about, are you eating from the food groups, or are you just eating lots of processed foods, or you're eating lots of carbohydrates or whatever. And lots of times people will admit that maybe they're eating too many Hot Pockets or whatever. Again, the nutrition and the idea of eating healthy is a big circle. So it's not like, people are just eating abnormally awful all the time. But we have to be careful how we allow ourselves to believe that people are eating healthy when they're not. And again, normal is really big in this case, and we have to be careful that we aren't accidentally ostracizing somebody because they feel like that we don't approve of their diet or whatever. So when we're talking about nutrition as well as hygiene, we need to be careful that we're making sound judgments that are fair to individuals. Same thing about like with hygiene. We want to make sure that people are showering or cleaning themselves at least 4 to 5 times a week. I know that there are people who don't take showers every day, and that's perfectly fine. There's the American Medical Association does not say that we need to take showers every day. And, but we want, when people come into session, stink should not waft off of them. And I'm a little bit more forward than other people are about that in therapeutic settings, to where I'll say, I noticed when you came in, it was pretty odorous. Are you able, do you have water in your home? Do you have enough money to buy soap and deodorant and other hygiene products like that? And people are usually pretty receptive to that. Sometimes not, but you know what? I'd rather people know that I'm aware of that and I'm willing to help them than them to just go in the world and be how they are. So nutrition and hygiene kind of go together there. Family relationships. Do you have a good relationship with the family? Do you feel like you're a close part of the family unit? So you could probably talk about the family relationships at the same time as when you were talking about their social network in the prior slide. So you can talk about those together. Kind of the same basic ideas as, do you feel close to people in your family? How much do you enjoy to be around the people in your family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Sexuality is another activity of daily living. There's lots of different ways to interpret sexuality if you use the term vaguely. So you could talk about gender expression, things like that, so LGBTQ aspects. But when I talk about sexuality, I generally talk about, are people expressing themselves with appropriate boundaries with sexual practices. I normally see adults, so I don't really have to be too concerned about underage sexuality expression, although I've dealt with plenty of that from a therapeutic standpoint. And with adults, it's usually, do you feel like you have control over your body? And to what degree do you feel like you might infringe on somebody else's ability to control their own body? And that's pretty much what I leave it at. It doesn't have to be a long drawn out thing, but lots of times what happens is I'll ask somebody, especially a woman, I'll say, do you feel like you have had control over your body your entire life? That's my way of digging into maybe some sexual abuse, especially if I suspect it based on other aspects. And you'd be surprised at how helpful that kind of questioning can be. So instead of saying, do you feel like you have control over your body right now in terms of your sexual preferences and your willingness and ability to have sex on your own terms? And generally they'll say, oh, yeah. But if I say, have you always had? They'll say, well, and then all of a sudden that well turns into a very long conversation about maybe child molestation, groping, or something like that. It's happened with men too. You'd be surprised at how often men have been sexually abused and aren't willing or able to talk about it for whatever reason. Maybe you're not surprised, but it does happen an awful lot. And then last is coping skills. Do the people have the skills that they need to cope with the stresses of life? You can probably talk about coping skills at the same time as problem solving. So problem solving is the ability to figure out a solution to an ordinary problem, whereas coping skills have to do with having the skills to manage stress. Okay, do you have outlets? Do you have sources of relaxation? What are they? Expound on them. You can have lots of conversations about coping skills. We are going to do an activity based on activities daily living. So be prepared for that. You want to be familiar with these. I'm going to basically give you a scenario and you tell me what the activity of daily living that we're talking about is and maybe what the deficits are. So the activities of daily living are part of the intake interview, but let's kind of jump into the broad aspects of the intake interview. So the intake interview is about 45 to 90 minutes depending on the practice that you're in. It should not feel like an interrogation. You'll want to use open-ended questions as much as you can. So a question might be something like, tell me about your parents when you were young. The examples that I've been giving you as I reflect on them as I'm speaking are a little bit close-ended. I'm asking a lot of do-you type questions. But, that's okay. I'm just kind of giving you examples off the cuff, so forgive me. But tell me about your parents when you were young, as opposed to were your parents mean to you or were your parents nice to you? Those are fine questions to ask if you only want to know about those ideas. But if you want to have them tell you about their parents and for you to interpret it, all you have to say is, tell me about your parents when you were young. How much did you get along with your siblings growing up? Tell me about being at home when you were growing up. A lot of questions like that can get a lot of good answers that you ordinarily wouldn't get just by having some kind of closed question. The other important aspect about all of this is you want to let the client feel like that you are not going to misuse their information, that them giving you information is not going to lead them feeling embarrassed or shamed or whatever. We want them to feel very comfortable talking to us in a safe environment because it may be the only opportunity they've had to do it, and if you blow it, it'll be the only time ever in their lives where they'll do it. So we need to make sure that we are very protective of this information. It's all very precious information. So we need to be very careful how we use it. And we want to give them the impression without like puking it onto them. We don't want to say every sentence, oh, and by the way, I would never misuse this information. You just want to give them the impression based on the conversation that you're having. Or you can even wrap it into a question. You can say, I know it can be difficult, and I hope that you trust that I'll keep this private, but can you tell me anything about your childhood that you might consider traumatic? By kind of setting up that question, you kind of coat every other question in the idea that I'm going to protect your information. And you don't have to say it for every question, but every so often when you're hitting a pretty tough topic, you would want to say it again. So if I said it for that question, then later on I said something like, you mentioned before that you didn't feel comfortable around your uncle because he seemed really, really fishy to you. Can you expand on that? And I don't know what you're really referring to, but it could be kind of yucky to talk about, and I appreciate that. So, if you'd like to expand on it, please go ahead. So you can kind of set them up like that and let people know that that it's hard to talk about it. And it kind of reiterates the fact that this is a private, protected moment and that you're going to be trustworthy. Now, some other general rules. If you're quoting an interviewee, indicate that using quotation marks. Anytime you write down exactly what somebody says, use quotation marks. Okay? The other thing that you want to do is don't make interpretations or otherwise assume things. This can be very dangerous because we've kind of grown in using APA and everything to paraphrase. When a client says something, don't interpret it. For example, instead of saying the client feels sad most of the time, you want to say something like the client reported feeling sad most of the time. What that means is that you are just saying what the client said. You're not making any interpretation about it. They said it, that's it. Okay? You need to attribute it to the client. We only want to report what's relevant and necessary. Don't add lots of fluff because you think it might make the case look good or anything. And don't ask questions for the sake of pure curiosity. If you're curious about something, tie it in, make it make sense, make it relevant. Don't force it to be relevant, but make it relevant. Just because you have this harebrained idea about something doesn't mean that you have to ask it, because it can make you seem like you're really off base, and that's off-putting to a client. You are allowed in these intake sessions to put information together. So if you talk, and we talked about it a little bit in the ADLs, but if you have information from two different domains like spiritual information and work history, that doesn't mean that you can't put them together. Here's a good example. The interviewee indicated that she had an interest in ministerial work, and for 3 years she served on the church's local board of administrators. Okay, those are two different things. One is about spiritual information, so the person talked about their faith, and it looks like it's Christianity in this case, and there was some ministerial work that she wanted to do, and in order to do that, she served on her church's local board of administrators. So there is some kind of occupational tie-in there. So you can put those two things together to create the story, even though they might not have said it together. So when you talk about your assignment, okay, we are going to cover these areas. So earlier in the PowerPoint, we talked about some overarching aspects, and a lot of them are the same, but this kind of gives a little bit more detail into the sections you're going to cover. When you do your intake assessment, you won't necessarily do bullet points, because that doesn't really contribute to a good flow, but you will use paragraphs, and you will lump sections together when it's necessary. But you're going to be using a client name, which is going to be obfuscated, which means that you're going to make it so that it doesn't make sense. Either you're going to use a completely made up name, or you're just going to use a number or whatever it is. That's completely fine. You're also going to make up a case number, whatever you want it to be, that's fine. You're also going to include the date of the interview, demographic information about your client, and that's just going to be whatever they tell you about themselves. Hopefully it's a role play, so it's made up. You can also include real stuff from your life if you'd like to, but please don't make this a therapeutic exercise. You're going to talk about your presenting problems, your educational history, and you can do your real educational history. So if you went to Charlotte High School and you're at Olivet College majoring in psychology, you can include that in your education. That's perfectly fine. You'll include medical history in so much as you feel comfortable making things up and talking about them. You can talk about family history. Again, make up whatever you'd like to. Your psychological history, please make that up. You will do an activities of daily living assessment, which means that you'll ask people how they're doing in those several areas, and you'll just write a sentence or two about how they're doing. If they're doing just fine, you can say that the client does not report any deficits in whatever the domain is. You'll include that diagnostic statement, which is really just a statement of what you think might be going on, which is also called sometimes a clinical summary or a clinical impression. It's really just you having a paragraph that kind of gives a thumbnail sketch of the case. What do you think is going on based on all the information that you have? So if somebody says that when they grew up they had a really mean teacher, so now they don't trust college professors, you can say that based on the information provided, the individual looks like they have an irrational fear of all teachers because they had a math teacher in high school that they weren't fond of, or they didn't get along with, or used emotionally abusive language for them, or whatever it is. So a diagnostic statement is really just taking all the information and putting into a paragraph that says what you think is going on. You also need to have a signature and the date of the report. Okay, so the date of the interview is probably going to be different than the date of the report. So whatever date you finish the report, that's the date that you have, as well as your signature. However it is, it could be any kind of signature. I see kind of a typo thing. It can be any kind of signature, so you can just type your name and that's adequate. And then the other thing you need is a signed confidentiality agreement. When you look at the assignment for the intake interview or assessment, you will see that there's some attached things there. One is a confidentiality agreement. That's the agreement that your partner needs to sign, and you need to send a copy of that or show a copy of that to me in class, so that I know that your person agreed to do this assignment with you. It's basically your informed consent for this assignment. Okay, so more on the setup of this assignment. I'm going to choose a partner with you, or for you, who you will complete an intake interview. You can do this over Zoom or FaceTime or whatever it is, but it needs to be video. Okay, the assignment is on Blackboard, and you will not receive any credit for this if you do not turn in your statement of confidentiality. So if you submit this assignment and it looks like it's an A job, and you don't turn in that agreement, it's a 0. Okay, we will look at this assignment in class on Blackboard together. You can also look at it on your own. That's fine too. Now, moving on. This initial session isn't just about getting information. It's also about building the initial relationship. And we do that by developing what we call rapport, which is kind of a fancy word for saying building a relationship. Okay? We're going to be entering a very personal relationship with our clients. That means that we're going to know a lot about them. And they need to feel comfortable telling us things, because the more comfortable they are, the more information we can get, the more we can help them. At the same time, it's a professional relationship, so you aren't going to be best buds with this person, but you are going to have a good, close relationship with them. There's a difference between being friends and being in a close therapeutic alliance. So when we want to interact with the individual, with the client, we want to do it in a way that facilitates free expression and open, honest communication. We want people to freely tell us how they really feel. There is nothing better than sitting across from somebody knowing that they are pouring things out to you. That puts a tremendous amount of responsibility on you, by the way, because you are safeguarding a lot of information that would kill this person if it got out. So they're making themselves vulnerable to you. And vulnerable is a really good word. There are lots of definitions for it. The one that I like the best is vulnerability is giving somebody permission to rip your heart out, but trusting that they won't. And that's what people are doing to you. Could you imagine if you told somebody a deep, dark thing that you didn't want anybody else on the planet to know, and then all of a sudden you found out that person told somebody? That would rip your heart out. You'd be so reluctant to tell anybody else about it. That's the pressure that we have. Those are the things that we have to be concerned about. Now, there aren't any set rules on how to set up relationships or build rapport, but we do have some general guidelines. I personally have a pretty good time with developing rapport with my clients. For whatever reason, it must be my charming personality. I don't know. But generally, people get along with me okay. Normally, I attribute it to the fact that the type of person that I am in session is the type of person that I really am. So what that means is that I am an authentic type practitioner. I am somebody who's going to practice the same way that I am in real life, and that comes across as authentic, and it makes people feel good. I don't know. Maybe you can tell me. Maybe you have more insight into why I'm so awesome. Now, some of the things that we need to be careful of and differentiate are attending behaviors versus client observation skills. So these attending behaviors are these things that we do to let people know that we are paying attention, and the client observation skills are the things that we do to reflect what the person has said or told to us. We also need to be paying attention to what they are doing. The book distinguishes these two behaviors just in order to define the terms. So just know that we use both attending and client observation skills together. Another thing you need to be careful of are door openers versus door closers. And you'd be surprised at how the same question asked differently can be a door opener versus a door closer. So if I said something like, who in your life has sexually abused you? Wow, that's a big question. And I might be reluctant to mention anything about it. But if I said something like, tell me about anybody who has sexually abused you in your life. That's a little bit different. Tell me about and who is it are two very different things. When you're asked to point out a person, that's asking the client to talk about being a victim, to pointing out somebody who has perpetrated something against them, as opposed to tell me about it. Tell me the story. What happened? Which gives them the freedom to tell me anything they want to. I haven't cornered them. I haven't asked them to focus on something specifically. I've asked them to tell me a story. They have the story to tell. I'm giving them permission to do it in a way that is open and honest. Now, how do we build the therapeutic relationship? Well, we use some pretty big words. Empathy. Empathy is the ability to feel as if somebody else is feeling. Okay, that means that we can understand how they feel. We don't have to have experienced it, but all we need to do is tap into the feeling. For example, you might be surprised to know that I have never done heroin. Hopefully you're not surprised by that. But I do know what it feels like to need something desperately, to crave something, to be to feel desperate. All right, I know what it feels like to have those feelings. So even though I don't have the experience of having done heroin or trying to get off heroin or whatever, I still have the same types of feelings and I can access those. Now, it won't be on the same depth, but I know what those feelings are like. We also want to have respect for the other person. You might recognize a lot of these, by the way, from person-centered therapy. Yay, person-centered therapy. We want to respect the other person. No matter where they are in life, we need to respect them because they've gone through some things and they deserve to have respect. Even when they don't have respect for us. It's one of those odd things to where you're like, well, I'll respect you if you respect me. Well, guess what? Nobody would ever respect anybody if that were the case, because someone's going to let you down. We want to have openness in accepting the client's expressions, no matter what the expression that they have, the verbal, physical, emotional, whatever it is. We need to accept the expressions, because we can close up an individual by not doing so. If somebody says that, well, when I was a little kid, I remember hitting my dog because it was eating off of my plate. And if I revolt and I'm like, oh, why would you do such a thing? They're not going to be able to tell me these things. They may be ashamed of what they did or whatever. And if I revolt, all I do is make them feel like they're going to close up. We also want to have understanding, meaning that we can understand how somebody could make a decision. We understand how somebody could do something not good. We understand how somebody could make a decision that's selfish. We need to be able to understand that. Even we don't have to agree with it, by the way, but we need to understand how somebody could do that. Our agreement is not required. Our understanding is. Well, you know what? Let me say that differently, because I don't think that we are required to understand everything. Our understanding that people can make bad decisions kind of is required. We don't need to understand how they got to it, but we need to understand that it can be gotten to. We need to be honest in our own expressing. Now, if something does revolt me, I can say, oh, wow, that kind of caught me off guard. Or I can kind of make a frowny face or a scowl or whatever. That's something I'm allowed to do. We also need to accept the client's feelings, which are inalienable. The way that people feel, whether or not they're on point, they can be misguided. They can be based on poor rationale. Whatever it is, their feelings are inalienable. We can talk about their feelings. We can help them process feelings. But whatever they are feeling in that moment is inalienable. That'd be like having a panic attack and somebody saying, you don't feel panic. You don't feel anxious. Well, yes, I do. It's like, no, this is not and you could go on and they could say something like, no, this isn't a situation where you should feel anxious. You don't really feel anxious. Okay, fine. Whether or not I should feel anxious is irrelevant. I do feel anxious. That's an inalienable feeling. And then the last, not last, but the last of this list is a genuine interaction. We want to make sure that we are feeling like we are engaging with somebody in a genuine manner. Now, I'm going to let you read through these. These are the levels of empathic listening. These are kind of ways that we can develop a hierarchy. And what's interesting about these is that I saw these on my national counselor's exam. And you had a scenario, and you had to say, based on the therapist's response, which level of empathic listening would it be? And you had to select the correct one. And really, they were just numbered. You're expected to know what these are. So I'm going to encourage you to look through these to kind of see what the differences are. We may or may not have an activity on this. I haven't really landed on that one yet. If we have time, maybe we will go back to it. Now, we've talked about how you build a therapeutic relationship. How do you break it down? Well, you can judge unnecessarily. We're going to make judgments because we need to have sound judgment and reasoning skills, but judging unnecessarily is not a good thing. Discounting feelings, that's not good. Insulting intelligence. Saying something like, well, you do know that, ... That doesn't help anything. Bobbleheading. I see a lot of new therapists always nodding. Yeah, nodding the head up and down. That's bobbleheading. We don't understand everything. We need to listen and not kind of reflect this. I'm listening to you, and you can tell by the fact that my head is bobbing up and down. Okay, whether or not that's a legitimate way to show active listening does not excuse the fact that we shouldn't be doing it all the time, probably. All right. The other is seeming rushed or hurried. Sometimes you are rushed, sometimes you are hurried for time or whatever, but we need to say something like, you know what, we're running out of time, so we need to talk about this last thing before you go, as opposed to just kind of sitting there impatiently tapping and looking nervously at the clock. It's better to verbalize that you're running out of time, or that it looks like we might need to shift topics because you were running out of time and you wanted to really get to that thing, or the person has something that they wanted to talk about at the beginning of the session that they were going to wait on. So we need to make sure that we are verbalizing that it's time to move on, as opposed to just looking impatient. Now, when we're building a relationship, a therapeutic relationship, we need to be aware of what the nature of the relationship is. So we need to always be aware of the intimacy of the relationship. Always be aware of how the other person is viewing the closeness of the relationship. And remember, intimacy oftentimes gets confused with romanticism. Romantic relationships are usually those between people who are in love, who have an eros type love that maybe it's erotic or sexual or romantic, whatever. We're talking about intimacy, which is just closeness, getting to know somebody. So we always need to be aware of that and to make sure that the boundaries are in place. We need to talk about the fact that clients will often get attached to therapists. We may be role modeling the best relationship they've ever had in their lives. We need to be aware of that. And to remember that that while we are their therapists, we are not their friends. We're not on call, all the time to tend to every single one of their needs. We need to be aware that sometimes people will have to wait for your services because you are not expected to respond every second of every day. Now, crisis is a little bit different, but generally, if somebody has a question or wants to talk to you outside a session, it can wait. There's this term, and there are different versions of this term, but really it's about response anxiety, where people expect a response really quickly from you, and if they don't, they get anxious about it. Remember, teach people that you are available to them for crisis. Otherwise, they can wait until their session, which is reasonable. We need to often remind them of that. You're going to feel like that you're responsible for the client at all times, but you need to develop good boundaries. At first, it's really hard because you want to save the world, but really you need to have good boundaries so that the individual doesn't take advantage of you. We are going to talk about this as a class, so be aware of this discussion. There's a couple other ones that are built into this, but take a look at this discussion, and you can prepare your responses for that just to have a discussion in the class, because there's lots of good information that comes out of this about understanding that we've all had relationships that have started well, not ended well, whatever. Last, record keeping. Now, we're talking just very broadly about record keeping. So when we're talking about record keeping, we're talking about how do you hold on to these bits of information that you've gotten from the individual. Well, keep some things in mind. Your records are discoverable in court situations. So when you are subpoenaed, your records that you've taken notes on, all of your opinions and thoughts about the individual, if you keep them all together, are discoverable. So they can use those. That's why we only put down information that's clinically relevant. So focus on the clinical relevance of your notes so that you don't accidentally release something that's not relevant and potentially damaging to the individual. Our judgments are important, but they're not part of the record. So unless you're doing an assessment, that's fine, but you don't need to put in there something like, this person divorced their wife, and I would never do that because, okay, you'd be surprised. People put that in there. All you're doing is reporting information. The idea here is confidentiality. If you have to err on the side of confidentiality, do it. You can literally take off all names and addresses, phone numbers from documents as long as you have, let me take that back. You can take that information off of case notes and things like that as long as you can identify the case based on a number that doesn't relate to anything else. So you give them a random number, or you start in a seriation, meaning that you start with patient 1 and you go all the way up until whatever. Keep all your records at work. It's a good boundary anyways, but now that we have electronic medical records, try to keep your work at work as much as you possibly can. I know that sometimes we do things away from work, but try to do as little at home as possible. That reduces the likelihood that you're going to have a breach of information. Remember that these are all professional documents, even your assignments, so treat them as such. Anytime you can have an electronic only version, that's okay. What I recommend doing a lot of the time is for these assignments is getting a document and typing it. And if you do have notes that you've taken, you can either take a picture of them and upload them somewhere secure, or you can destroy them, and we can destroy them after that, or you keep them in some kind of secure place. For the purposes of our records for this class, make sure that nothing has a real student's name on it except for your own, but make sure that no other information identifiable If somebody's a member of a sorority, just say that they are a member of a sorority. That's it. That way they can't, or that way if your records fall out of your backpack or whatever on your way back and forth to your session, or if your roommate's looking through your stuff because they're snoopy, they don't see any information. Even if you live off campus and there's not a strong likelihood that somebody comes across anybody else who's on your work, it doesn't matter. We're extra careful. We err on the side of confidentiality, so be careful. That we're going to stop for today, and we'll pick up with the working phase, starting the working phase next class. If you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you and seeing what you can do with this information.